Okay, the second tutorial is a review of creating classes. A class, you may remember, is a template to make a bunch of similar objects. So in this example, we're going to make a class called dot that is going to make a dot appear and move, and then we're going to modify it so we can make a whole bunch of dots really easily. If I wanted to make more than one moving dot on this screen, I would have to individually program all of them. I'd have to make these, the different ellipse shape functions, but if I wanted them moving independently of one another, I'd probably have to go and I'd have to make a variable for each one of them, at least one variable, maybe even two if I want them moving in two directions. So creating a class helps us eliminate having to do a lot of manual work that we can automate if things are going to be kind of similar. So to make a class, your class will come after your draw method. So you have setup is open that bracket, close that bracket for setup, open the bracket for draw, close the bracket for draw, and then below it we're going to make a class. The other place that you could put a class is if you want to use tabs. You can come and there's this little downward pointing arrow here. You can make a new tab and you give the new tab the same name as the class name, and you would make it and a new tab would appear. But for right now, I'm just going to put it all in one view so you can see everything all at once. I'm actually going to make this window a little bigger too. So class with a lowercase c, it won't work if you put an uppercase C, but we are actually going to use a capital letter for our class name. It will work if you have a class name that doesn't have a capital letter, but the standard is to make it a capital. Then you're going to open a bracket. This is the bracket for the whole class. Don't put an open close parentheses here. The class name does not have that. I'm just going to go down a bunch of lines and close the class bracket so I don't forget. Notice if my cursor is next to either an open or a closed bracket, the corresponding bracket on the other place on the screen will get a box around it. That's so you can help check to see if you have an error with your brackets. You can check to make sure they're all opened and closed. All right, so back to our class. So the next thing we're going to put in our class is something called the constructor. It's the same name as the class, also capitalized. Then with your open and close parentheses, I'm going to leave them empty, nothing inside right now. This is where I've taken any temporary variables if I needed them, but we're not going to worry about that yet. I'm going to open a bracket, and then I'm going to skip a couple lines and close that bracket. In the constructor is where we're going to initialize all our class variables, and that's where you'd use those temporary variables to assign them to class variables if we're going to do that. So that happens here. Class variables are declared after the class name but before the constructor, and they are only visible in the class. So I'll show you what that means. If I have int x and int y, these class variables here, and we'll give them the starting values, x equals 100, y equals 100, and then I try to use x in draw. I'm going to get the error field component x is not visible. That means that the program in draw is saying I don't know what x is, and that's because you can only use x inside the class. Different from a global variable that way, where you could use anywhere. All right, so you've got your variables declared. You've got your variables initialized, starting values. Now you need to make some methods. The convention for the method name that we give to the method that has the functions that make the object show up is usually display. So if we say void display, that's where we're going to put our shape functions. So in here, let's see, I'll have a fill, go to my color selector, get this teal color, paste it in, then I'm just going to make an ellipse. I'm going to use those class variables x and y for the location, make it 50 by 50 in size, and this is a complete class now. It's got class variables, the variables are initialized, and they're used here in the display, and the display is a complete method with a bracket that closes it. There's a bracket that closes the whole class. The constructor has open and close brackets. Now I can use it. So I'm going to make an object from this class. So the class is the template, and the object is what it can make. So to make just one object, I could say dot, and I'll call it the object name. It's also called an instance variable. That means it's a variable, but it's an instance of a class. So let's call it Dottie. That's my class name. And here in setup, I'm going to say Dottie, the object name, equals new dot. Make a new dot object from called Dottie. So you're going to that class dot and making a new object called Dottie. So declare it up here, just like you would declare a variable, initialize it in the setup, and now I can use it in draw. The way you call the methods on an object made for a class is something called, I should have picked something different. It's called dot syntax because you use a little period. So if I'm going to write Dottie dot display, means call the display method on Dottie. And it knows it's the display method from the dot class because Dottie is a dot object. And what I said before, this is called dot syntax, has no relationship to the fact that I poorly chose to name my class dot. This dot means a period. That means this period right here. But that's the way you call these methods. So now if I play it, it will call the display method on object Dottie, and it will show up. So if we want to make Dottie move, we're going to make a new method in the class. So after the bracket that closes display, but before the bracket that closes the class, I'm going to make a method called void move. And here, I'm just going to use an algebraic equation to add a value onto the x value so it'll move horizontally across the screen. I'm going to close the bracket that opens up my move method. And now if I play it, nothing different is going to happen because I haven't called the move method on my new object Dottie. I've just told Dottie to display. So if I want Dottie to move, I have to say Dottie.move. Now Dottie will move. There she goes. All right, so I said I could make it easy to make a bunch. So if I wanted to make a new dot, I could make a new object, and I could call this one maybe Spotty. And then if I called the methods on Spotty, I have to initialize Spotty too. Spotty equals, it's also an instance variable of the dot class, so Spotty equals new dot. Now, I can call methods on Spotty the same way. Just Spotty.display, Spotty.move. Unfortunately, we're not going to see Spotty because both Dottie and Spotty have the same starting location and the same speed at which they're moving, so they're actually on top of each other. So if I want to make them easy to see both of them, instead of having x and y start at 100, I'm going to have them start at some random location between 0 and 450 or 500. So this means a random number between 0 and 500. And if I do that, I actually can't make x an integer variable. It needs to be a float variable because the random function gives values that are not integers. They have decimals associated with them too. So now they start at different places. I can do the same thing for y if we want. Oops. Oh, yep. See? Cannot convert from float to int. That means I need to make y a float variable. So now you've got 2. So it's very easy to make a bunch of objects without having to give them different variables and without having to go and program them each individually in Draw. So that's just the basics of how you set up a class. Again, you've got class variables, a constructor where you initialize variables, and then any methods that, in our case, display and move the objects, but you can have as many methods as you want, and you can call them whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. These are just two conventional names that we will use a bunch.